My name is Lucas, 24 years old, and there is a moment in my life that I will never be able to describe fairly. Not for lack of words, I spent months searching for the right ones, but because certain things only exist in their entirety when they happen, and any attempt to reconstruct them later already carries a sense of loss. It was noon. The sun of that January in Minas had no mercy. That's not just a figure of speech, it's literal. The kind of heat that flattens the air, that makes the red earth glow as if there were fire beneath it, leaving the horizon waving like melting gelatin. I was alone on a distant stretch of pasture, far from any shade, and I fell. There was no fanfare or desperation. There was only the moment when my legs understood before I did that my body had reached its limit, and then the ground was too close, and then it was beneath me, and I was in the middle of the cracked red earth with the sun hammering the back of my neck. I heard the footsteps before opening my eyes. Heavy, rhythmic boots, the kind of stride that doesn't run, but arrives quickly, all the same. And then there was a shadow, a physical relief so immediate, I almost cried just from the darkness. Lucas. Renato Carvalho's voice didn't ask for attention. It simply existed, deep and without hesitation, and the world reorganized itself around it. He was kneeling beside me, 58 years old, a former military police sergeant, the most reserved man I had ever met, on his knees in the dry earth, looking at me with an expression I didn't yet know how to read. "May I check your pulse?" he asked. He didn't say, "I'm going to check it." It wasn't an automatic gesture. He asked for permission before touching me. Even there, with me half fainted on the ground, he asked for permission. I must have nodded. I don't remember clearly. What I remember is the sensation. His fingers on my pulse. Thick, calloused, cold, despite the absurd heat that was in everything. A controlled, professional touch of someone who had done this before. The fingers pressed lightly and stayed there, counting without haste. For a moment that should have been neutral. That should have been nothing more than a first aid procedure. I was unable to think of anything else but that contact. Then something changed in Renato's face. It wasn't gradual. It happened all at once. His eyes widened, not from shock, but from something deeper, more internal. His hand left my pulse. It went straight to his own chest, on the left, with a pressure that was reflex, not choice. And I saw the exact moment when Renato Carvalho's body decided, on its own, that it had reached the limit of something. He collapsed. He didn't fall forward or backward. He crumbled, as if his joints had decided all at once that it was no longer time. And the man who had spent decades being authority, structure, an unshakable presence, was on the ground beside me, eyes closed, with the red earth beneath both of us. I'll tell you what happened next. But first, I need to tell you how we got to that moment. Because what happens in seconds like this always begins long before, in conversations that seemed small, in silences that held too much, in a summer that transformed two men who had nothing to do with each other into men who could no longer be who they were before they met. Have you ever felt that something was coming before you understood what it was? That life was building something around you, brick by brick, and you'd only realize it when the last piece fell into place? It was exactly like that. I was 24 years old and had an apartment in São Paulo that was more dead than home when I decided it was time to leave. I didn't really decide. Things started deciding for me, as usually happens when we spend too much time letting things slide. The job went first. A logistics company that had signed a contract that saved half the salaries and then let everyone go on the same day in March, in an email with the subject, "Organizational restructuring," which was just a cleaner way of saying it was over. Then the apartment, because without a salary, there was no sense in holding on to rent in a city that owes you nothing. And in the end, the question I had avoided for 2 whole years. So what now? There was no ready answer. What I had was Uncle Geraldo's number saved on my phone and a call I made on a Tuesday night with a voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Uncle Geraldo Andrade, 61, a farmer from the interior of Minas, with the practicality of someone who never needed more than 3 words when one was too many, said, "Come over," without asking anything. And I showed up. The farm is about 30 kilometers from the nearest town. You arrive by the asphalt road, turn onto a dirt road, pass a dry creek bed in January, and reach an iron gate that groans when it opens, as if protesting against anything that arrives. I had visited before, during childhood vacations, but I had never arrived as someone who was going to stay. The countryside has a rhythm that the city doesn't prepare us to understand. It's not slow in the poetic way that people from São Paulo romanticize when they're tired. It's slow in a way that demands something, that you stop filling the silence, that you stop checking your phone, looking for the next stimulus to distract you from yourself. The silence of the countryside isn't an absence. It's the presence of too many things you had learned not to hear. I settled into a back room at my uncle's house, small and smelling of old wood and mothballs. The bed creaked. The window looked out over the pasture. In the first few weeks, I'd wake up before the sun, because the cattle would start making noise, and I didn't know how to sleep in a silence that wasn't really silence anymore. My uncle put me to work without ceremony, checking fences, helping with the milking, accompanying the foreman on the usual rounds. Physical, honest work that tired my body in a way office work never could. I slept heavily. I didn't think much. It was almost enough. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, a week and a half after I arrived, that I saw him for the first time. I was outside fixing a hose when I noticed movement on the other side of the rusty gate that divided my uncle's farm from the neighboring property. A figure with his back turned, broad shoulders, a straight posture that didn't look practiced. It looked structural, as if that man's spine had never learned how to hunch. Work pants, long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, a hat on his head. He was working on a fence with efficient movements, unhurried and without hesitation, every gesture in the exact right place. I stared longer than made sense. I couldn't see his face, just his posture, and that already said something I didn't know how to name yet. That this man occupied the space in a different way, as if the world around him knew it should yield. Afterward, I went inside and didn't think about it anymore. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The real meeting happened 5 days later because of a stray head of cattle. My uncle's cattle had a habit of looking for holes in fences, an old practice that anyone who knows the countryside knows. An ox doesn't need a reason to cross if there's space. One of the cows crossed over to the neighbor's property during the night, and my uncle's foreman, who had left early for a doctor's appointment, sent me to go get her. "Do me a favor and let Renato know," my uncle said as I grabbed the gate key. "A serious man, you'll see, but a fair dealer, no nonsense." I crossed the rusty gate, which opened with the same protest as always, that high-pitched creak that seemed to say it preferred to stay closed, and headed toward the house. He came to meet me before I reached the door. He'd already seen me coming. Renato Carvalho was taller than I'd calculated from a distance, about 6 feet or so, with the bulk of someone who never needed to hit the gym because the work had already done the job. 58 years old, that had left marks on his hands and face, but not on his posture. That straight spine was the real deal. Grey hair cut short, a few days stubble, dark brown eyes that looked at you without haste, but without looking away. "New neighbor," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lucas, Geraldo's nephew." I held out my hand. He shook it once, firm, without exaggeration. Found the cow this morning. She's in the back pasture." He turned without further explanation and started walking, expecting me to follow. I followed. We walked in silence for the first few minutes. Renato's pasture was different from my uncle's, more controlled, with clearer divisions, fences in better repair. I noticed it without wanting to, just as I noticed the way he walked without looking at his feet, as if the terrain were an extension of his own body. "Liking the countryside?" he asked when we got near the spot where the cow was grazing peacefully, as if she hadn't caused any trouble at all. "I'm still adjusting." He made a sound that could have been agreement or understanding, or both at the same time. "The countryside isn't for everyone. The city softens some things that the field requires." It wasn't a criticism, it was just an observation, the kind that comes from someone who has spent enough time seeing patterns to recognize them without judgment. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Renato caught the cow with ease, a gesture that showed it was routine, not effort, and handed me the lead without comment. While I got organized, he stood looking at the boundary line between the two properties with an expression I couldn't read. "The boundary fence has needed repair for a while," he said. "I'll tell Geraldo when he shows up, or you tell me." "I'll tell him." "Good." And then, almost as an afterthought, "Your uncle said you were in São Paulo. Logistics, was it?" I was surprised he knew. It was. "Didn't work out?" Direct, the question. No beating around the bush, but also no malice. The kind of frankness that doesn't need an apology, because it's not trying to hurt, it's trying to understand. I could have gotten defensive. I didn't. It didn't. He nodded once. Sometimes the thing that didn't work out is the thing that needed to fail. And he turned to leave. Uncle Geraldo showed up soon after, coming through the gate I'd left open, and the two of them greeted each other with the familiarity of people who have known each other for years. Not close friends, but neighbors who respect each other's space and know they can count on one another when needed. Renato was a military police sergeant, my uncle told me later, in a casual observation as we walked back. Retired about 4 years ago. A good man. Serious, but good. Serious, but good. I held on to that. Because that night, back in my room smelling of mothballs, I realized I'd spent a considerable part of the day thinking about Renato's voice. The way it came out without needing to announce itself. The way the words arrived unadorned. No rambling, no performance, no trying to please. Like his posture while he walked. Like his hands calloused, large, precise. I tried not to pay attention to it. It's curious how trying to ignore something only makes it take up even more space in your mind. The very effort of looking away becomes an inescapable fixation. There was no agreement, no formal proposal, no talk of, "Let's work together." It happened in the way the countryside allows, because in the countryside, things have more room to happen the way they need to. It started with the boundary fence. Renato showed up on a Monday morning with tools and a look that said it was going to be done that day. No discussion. I was nearby. I went to help. It didn't need more than that. We worked almost in silence for 2 hours. He taught when he needed to teach. "Don't do it like that. It'll give way later. This staple here, not that one." And I learned without him needing to explain twice. There was something satisfying about it. Work that had a visible beginning, middle, and end. The fence that was in bad shape and became good. The physical satisfaction of something fixed with your own hands. Then came a leak in the water pump that served both properties. Then, a pasture issue that Renato knew better. Then I helped with the clearing on his side, and he helped with moving cattle on my uncle's side. No prior arrangement. One saw what the other needed and showed up. My uncle didn't find it strange. It was the neighborhood custom. You help, you get help. No keeping score. During the breaks, Renato would talk. Not much, never much, but what he said stuck. Pieces of a life I was putting together, without realizing I was doing it. One afternoon, sitting in the shade of an almond tree drinking water, he spoke about the cattle he raised alone, now that he no longer had a permanent employee. About how the rhythm of the countryside was different from the rhythm of the corporate world. There was always someone breathing down your neck, always a deadline, always a regulation. Here, the only deadline is the sun. There was something in the way he said, the corporation, with a distance that wasn't resentment, it was just detachment. Like someone talking about a phase that had ended. Another time, helping move water troughs, he mentioned his son. Just a name, Paulo, said in passing. He lives in Belo Horizonte. We talk once in a while, and the way he said once in a while had a specific weight that I recognized. It's not bitterness, it's an acceptance that still hurts a bit around the edges. And one morning, closer to the end of the month, while we were fixing a gate that had lost its hinge, he looked at the horizon in a way that wasn't contemplation, it was calculation, and said, I came here when Helena died. I thought it would be easier in a place I already knew. A pause. It's not easier, it's just different. Helena, his wife, 22 years of marriage. But at that moment, Renato didn't explain anything, and I didn't ask anything, and the information landed in the space between us, like something that existed and didn't need elaboration to be real. I was paying attention in a way that I couldn't stop. It was a fascination deeper than simple admiration, more disturbing than mere curiosity. It was the first time in my life that I found myself tracking a person without being able to explain why, noticing the angle of the light on his shoulders when he walked against the sun, the way he would stop talking in the middle of a sentence when he decided the rest didn't need to be said, the way his hands moved while working, steady, unhurried, as if each gesture were the only one that existed in that moment. This frightened me, not in a sharp way. It was a slow startle, the kind you only notice when you're already in the middle of it, when you look back and see the path you've traveled without realizing. And then you realize that what you feel isn't something simple that will pass with time and the exhaustion of work. A moment comes when self-delusion loses its power. The moment when reality unravels the comfortable narrative we create for ourselves. I told myself it was the context, that it was the loneliness of the countryside, the lack of company my own age, the rarity of human contact outside of my uncle and the few farmhands. I told myself it was fascination with a way of being very different from mine, that it was the novelty of a man who carried authority without needing to announce it. I told myself many things. None of them were lies, but none of them were the whole story. There was a sound of cicadas that night that I never forgot. It was early February, 6 weeks after I had arrived. I had stayed late at Renato's property, helping with a water ditch issue that was going to take time. And when we finished, it was nearly 8 at night, and he said, unceremoniously, "Have some water before you go." Renato's porch was different from my uncle's, smaller, tidier, with 2 wooden chairs that had that wear of continuous use, not the wear of something abandoned, but of something lived in. A low table between the chairs. In the background, the dark pasture and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night. The conversation started where it always starts. Work, weather, the state of the stream that had dropped too low because of the heat. Real, concrete things, easy to say. I talked about an irrigation technique I had researched. He talked about how the countryside was different from what it was 20 years ago. And then, in a way that I couldn't quite trace, the conversation went somewhere else. 32 years in the corporation, Renato said. It wasn't a complaint, it was an inventory. I started at 26. I left at 58. More than half of my adult life inside a system that teaches you a lot about how to be one specific thing. I stayed quiet. When Renato spoke like that, slowly, with that measured weight, I had learned that the right thing to do was not to interrupt. Sergeant, husband, father, every role with a manual, you know. An expected way to do everything. He looked out at the dark horizon. I was good at all of them. I fulfilled them all. But there's a difference between being good at something and being yourself within that thing. The sound of cicadas filled the space he left. Do you think... I started and stopped, not quite knowing what I was asking. That I did it wrong? Renato shook his head slightly. It's not that. It's just that when you spend too much time being what the world needs you to be, at some point you start wondering if you can tell the difference between what you chose and what you just accepted. A pause. I came to the country to find some peace. But sometimes, I think peace isn't exactly the right word. Sometimes, I think I came so I could finally look at a few things without the noise of everything else. He didn't say what those things were. And those words stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Because Renato was talking about decades of a life built on a performance of who you were expected to be, and I was 24, I'd never been a sergeant or a husband or a father, yet it fit me in a way that left me breathless for a second. Because I also knew what it was like. Not in the same way, not on the same scale, but I knew that feeling of being competent in a version of yourself, without knowing if it was the true version. Of occupying a space that wasn't exactly yours. I didn't say any of that. It wasn't the time. But Renato turned his head slightly and looked at me. Not straight on, but from the side, the way people look when they don't want to make the moment too big, and said, "You listen in a different way." How do you mean? You don't just wait for your turn to speak, you actually listen. He looked forward again. It's rare. I left shortly after. The rusty gate creaked again as I crossed back to my uncle's farm. The night was heavy with heat, and the smell of dry earth mixed with the diesel from the day's equipment. I didn't sleep for a long time that night. And on the dark porch on the other side of the gate, I was fairly certain Renato didn't either. Sleep simply refuses to come when a presence settles into your thoughts without asking permission. And you realize that, deep down, you don't want to push it away. You don't have to be perfect all the time. But sometimes, the body decides on its own that it has reached its limit, and it doesn't ask if it's a good time. It was 10 in the morning on a Friday, the heat already hitting 40 degrees before noon, and I was alone in a distant stretch of pasture, far from the house, far from shade. Far from anything but cracked earth and sun. The foreman had gone to town. My uncle had company. I went to check a fence issue at the furthest point of the property, alone, at the worst possible time. Later, I would understand it was an error in judgment. At the time, I just thought I could handle it. The heat hit differently around 10:30. First came the dizziness light, the kind you brush off. Then a feeling that the world was a step ahead, that I had to push harder than I should to coordinate what my feet were doing. Then a buzzing that started in my ears and took over everything. And then I was on the ground. I don't remember falling. I remember the ground, the roughness of the red earth against my face, the smell of hot dust, the feeling that the sun was pressing down from above like a hand that was too large. I tried to get up and couldn't. I tried to organize my thoughts, and the thoughts wouldn't let themselves be organized. I closed my eyes. Later, footsteps. The same footsteps. The same voice. Lucas. Renato was kneeling beside me. His shadow was the first relief I felt. And then came what I already knew was coming. and yet it pierced through me just like the first time. "May I check your pulse?" His hand found my pulse, those thick fingers, cold despite the heat, the exact pressure I had spent weeks trying not to think about. He counted. He stayed quiet for a second, that lasted longer than it should have. And the world shrank down to that single point of contact. Then Renato's expression changed, all at once. His eyes widened. His hand left my pulse and went straight to his own chest, on the left. The pressure of someone recognizing something the body knew before the mind. "Renato." My voice came out stronger than I expected. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the man beneath the ex-sergeant. I saw the shock of a man who had spent decades being unshakable, discovering that the body has its own rules that don't negotiate with authority. And then he collapsed. His body gave way, without warning. He crumbled to the side, like a structure that suddenly loses its main support. The hard, dusty ground caught us both. I don't quite know what happened in the next few minutes. I know I got up or tried to, and fell again, and got up once more. I know I screamed, and that the scream came out louder than I knew I was capable of. I know I grabbed my phone with hands that weren't quite cooperating and called emergency services, giving the address as clearly as I could, saying it was a heart attack, and the operator told me not to hang up. I stayed by Renato's side. I put my hand on his shoulder because I didn't know what else to do. The sun kept hammering down. The cicadas kept singing, and the man who had just asked permission before checking my pulse was lying beside me, motionless, with the scorching soil of Minas beneath us. The ambulance took 18 minutes. Every one of those minutes was the longest I've ever lived. The town hospital was small 16 beds, a 4-bed ICU, an emergency room that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. I went in the ambulance because there was no one else to go, and after handing Renato over to the doctors and answering the triage questions, I sat in a beige plastic corridor and realized I couldn't leave. I didn't ask myself why at that moment. I didn't have the energy for it. There was only the plastic chair and the corridor and the door the doctors had entered and hadn't come out of yet. I called my uncle. He showed up 40 minutes later, still in his company's coming clothes, confused and worried in just the right measure, not too alarmed, not too distant. That was my uncle. He sat down next to me, asked the nurse for coffee, and looked at me in a way that said he was waiting for me to explain. "I was passing by when he fell," I said. Uncle Geraldo nodded. "Good thing you were there." He didn't ask anything else. 2 hours later, a doctor in a white coat with the look of someone who'd been working since dawn came out to speak with the family. There was no family. There was just me and my uncle. "Acute myocardial infarction," the doctor said. "Stable. He got here quickly, which helped a lot. He'll be under observation, probably for 2 days. After that, he'll need rest and follow-up care." My uncle asked about his son. Someone had already tried calling a number in Renato's cell phone saved as Paulo. It had gone to voicemail twice. "Is he going to be okay?" I asked. The doctor looked at me with that quick assessment ER doctors develop relative, friend, neighbor, necessary alert level. "He'll need care. But yes, he should be fine." Should. My uncle went to get some water. I stayed in the plastic chair. I should have left. There was no practical reason for me to stay. Renato was stable. My uncle could handle whatever was needed. I had work at the farm early in the morning. The logical thing was to go. I stayed. There are times when logic loses its usefulness. You can't formulate a reason to stay, so you stay anyway. As if the body knew before the mind that this was exactly where it needed to be. My uncle left at midnight. He had to deal with the cattle early. He looked at me before leaving with an expression I couldn't quite read, but I tucked it away to think about later. I stayed alone in the hallway until 3 in the morning, when a nurse said Renato was awake and was asking who was waiting. The room was small. Tubes, monitors, that rhythmic hum of equipment that exists to remind you the heart is working as it should. Renato was lying there, his color still faded, his few days beard a bit longer, without his work shirt, without his hat, without the posture I had learned to recognize from afar. Smaller, somehow. Not diminished, just human in a way I hadn't seen before. He looked at me when I entered. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You stayed," he said. His voice was hoarse, quieter than usual. I stayed. Geraldo left. He did, but I stayed. He kept looking at me in a way I couldn't categorize. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to recognition, like someone who saw something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. "I was afraid," he said lower. The word came out like something that cost him, from a man who had spent his whole life building walls around that word. Walls that had stayed outside when the white coat came in with the electrodes. Not of the heart attack. Well, the heart attack too, but of something else. I did what I had learned to do with Renato. I stayed quiet. I was afraid of going without having said a few things. The sentence hung in the air of the small room like a physical object. The monitor beep-beeped the rhythm of his heart. Outside in the hallway, a nurse passed by unhurriedly. I didn't ask what those things were. Not because I didn't want to know, because I felt that asking at that moment would be taking something that needed to arrive at the right time, that the question would push, and pushing wasn't what Renato needed in that early morning in a small town hospital room. Renato closed his eyes shortly after. I sat in the plastic chair in the room until he fell asleep. Then I went to the hallway. Then, to the bench outside the hospital, under a pre-dawn sky that was full of stars, in a way only the countryside allows, without the city's light pollution. Each star in the exact place where it had always been, with no one to put it out. I stayed there, thinking about what he had said. And on that bench, at 4 in the morning, with the smell of dry earth even there in town, I stopped lying to myself about what I felt. I didn't name it yet, but I stopped pretending I didn't know. This story deserves to be told properly, because what happened next wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Renato stayed 5 days in the hospital. Then he went home by ambulance, with a list of medications, restricted exertion, and a recommendation for rest for at least 3 weeks. His son, Paulo, arrived on the 3rd day, a man about 35, with his father's posture, but without his quietness, who stayed for 2 days, handling what needed to be handled, and then returned to Belo Horizonte with the promise to call more. I saw him once, briefly, in the hospital corridor. He greeted me, shook my hand, and said, "Thank you for staying," in a way that made it seem like he was fulfilling an obligation, more than feeling what he said. I didn't judge. Sometimes families are like that. Renato went home, and I started showing up. Not every day at first, every other day, under the pretext of checking if he needed anything from town, or if there was work on the property he couldn't handle himself. The excuse was real enough to be plausible. I'd bring food my uncle sent over, check the meds Renato forgot to take on time, and help with the little things he actually let me help with. One afternoon, he was on the porch when I arrived, and he told me, "I already knew you were coming," before I could even say a word. It wasn't a criticism, it was acknowledgement. He let me. And sometimes, when I was leaving, he'd stand at the porch door, watching me until I crossed the rusted gate. I saw it. I knew I saw it. I stopped pretending I didn't. One Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the heart attack, We were sitting on the porch at sunset, that Minas Gerais sunset that paints the sky a burnt orange and makes the world slow down for half an hour before it gets dark. Out of nowhere, Renato turned to me and asked, "Why did you stay at the hospital all night?" The question held no hostility. There was no trap. It was curiosity, the same direct, unadorned curiosity I had learned to associate with him. But this time, there was something more. An opening. As if he knew the question would demand more than a simple answer, and he had decided to ask anyway. I looked toward the horizon. The sun was melting at the edge of the property, orange turning almost red against the horizon line. There were smaller versions of what I was feeling, all true in part. But there was something about that afternoon, the orange sky, the silence of the cicadas, the 3 weeks of visits and meds and pretexts we didn't need but kept up anyway. The thing he had said in the hospital about being afraid of leaving without saying a few things, there was something in all of it that made it impossible to give anything less than the truth. "Because I couldn't leave," I said. A pause. The song of the cicadas filled the space. It wasn't just neighborly concern. It wasn't just that there was no one else there. It was that I needed to know you were going to be okay. In a way that didn't fit any other explanation, I tried to give myself. My voice came out softer than I intended. And I think I've been paying attention to you for a long time, in a way that doesn't have a simple explanation. I find myself thinking about things you've said. When you don't show up on a workday, I notice you're missing before I even realize I've noticed. The twilight lingered. The sun continued its descent. I've never said that out loud before, I continued. To anyone. Not even to myself, really. But you asked, and I can't give you an answer smaller than that. I paused. I took a breath. I don't know exactly what it is. It doesn't need a name right now. We don't need to label it or define it. But it's real. And you deserve to know it's real. Renato fell silent. Not an uncomfortable silence. Renato's silence was never uncomfortable. It was always a silence that was doing something. He looked toward the horizon line where the sun was nearly gone. He ran a hand over his face in a gesture I had seen before, the gesture of someone deciding how much they were going to say. 58 years, he began, and his voice carried a weight I recognized as the weight of something kept stored for too long in a place too small for it. I waited. For 58 years, I was whatever they needed me to be. A sergeant. There's a right way to be a sergeant, and I learned it and did it. I fulfilled it. A husband. There's an expected way, and I truly loved Helena. It wasn't a performance. It was real. A father. There's a manual for that too, and I tried to follow it. He paused. But there are things that stayed underneath all of that. Things I would look at out of the corner of my eye and push away because they didn't fit. Because the cost of looking at them head on was too high. The cicadas sang in the pasture as it grew dark. There's a difference between never having examined something and not knowing it exists, he said. The sentence hung in the air. You were the first person in a long time who made me want to examine. Renato turned to me, then facing me directly, not glancing sideways, in a way I hadn't seen before, with an expression that was both harder and more open than anything I had ever seen on his face. And when I was lying in that hospital, afraid that my time had come, the thing I didn't want to leave unsaid wasn't at all what I expected it to be. What was it? I asked softly. He was quiet for a moment longer, not from hesitation, from choice. Like someone who had spent his whole life being precise with words and was being precise now in the most important way. That I see you, he said. just like that. The way you are, what you're trying to understand about yourself, what you carry, the way you listen. I see you. And I didn't want to die without having said that. I felt those words in a place that had no precise name, in a place that became quiet and vast at the same time, like when something you've been waiting for finally arrives and you realize you've been holding that space open for a long time. And then, Renato Carvalho's hand, the same hands I had noticed the first time I saw him from behind fixing a fence, the same ones that had checked my pulse in that sweltering pasture, the same ones that had spent decades wielding authority, building structures, and holding on to what needed to be held, reached for mine with hesitation. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a hand that reached out slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone doing for the first time something that had always existed beneath many other things. It rested on mine on the arm of the chair. It stayed there, with that honest hesitation of someone who isn't sure if they'll be accepted, but chose to try anyway. I didn't pull away. We stayed like that. The orange sky turned purple and then dark blue. The cicadas buzzed incessantly. At some point in the night, a faint breeze drifted across the pasture, bringing the scent of dry earth and grass. No more words were needed than those. There was something between us that didn't have a name yet, that perhaps didn't need a name yet, that could just be for a while, without us needing to define every boundary. And we both knew it now. And it was the first time, for each of us, in our own specific way, that we knew, without having to hide the knowing. Growth, I realized on that porch, isn't in what you accumulate. It's in what you stop pretending doesn't exist. In those hands, reaching out slowly. In that choice not to pull away. That's enough to start. I'm not going to tell you that everything was resolved, because it wasn't. And a story that told you it was would be doing you a disservice. The small town still exists. Renato is 58 years old and has a heart that will need care for the rest of his life. I'm 24, and I don't know exactly what life I want to build, or which version of myself will exist 5 years from now. The age gap between us is real, and the small town has eyes, and Renato's family has expectations that don't include whatever is happening on that porch at sunset. There's no clean solution for any of those things. But something fundamental changed in the days after that conversation. It didn't turn into a grand declaration. Renato isn't one for grand declarations, and I learned I don't need to be. It turned into a different kind of presence. It became the way he looked at me when I arrived at the property, without needing to rearrange his face for what was expected. It became the way I crossed the rusty gate, without needing a pretext to explain why I was going there. One afternoon, a week after the confession, Renato said, "I don't know what will happen, but I know I don't want to pretend it isn't anymore." And I said, I didn't either. And that was all that needed to be said at that moment. We don't need to resolve everything right now. There's a gate between two worlds, rusty, noisy, complaining every time it opens, hurting your hands if you aren't careful. And for a long time, we each stayed on our own side, because crossing costs something, because the rust is real, because what's on the other side is too unknown to be easy. But when you finally cross, and when the other person is waiting on the same side, not on the far side, but on the same side you chose together, the gate still creaks. It still costs something, but you're on the other side, and the other person is there. And that changes the whole equation. Renato and I are learning what it means to be on the same side, without rushing, with care, with that quiet courage that doesn't have a grand name, but exists in every morning you choose not to pretend. There's one thing this story taught me that I didn't expect to learn this way. That naming what you feel, out loud, to someone who matters, is one of the most courageous acts there is. Not because it's easy, precisely because it isn't. Because you don't know what will happen on the other side. Because you might get the timing, the person, or the place wrong. And yet, sometimes, something happens. A heart attack, a fall, an orange sunset on the porch, and you realize that the price of not naming it is higher than the price of naming it wrong. We all know the weight of carrying a feeling for too long. That sensation of knowing something is real, but being unable to find the right moment, the right courage, the right words to say it out loud. If this story touched something in you, leave a like. It helps this story reach those who need it. Tell us in the comments. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't need a full explanation. Just whatever is true. And subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Stories that aren't afraid to be real, that don't need a perfect resolution to be true. You don't have to be perfect all the time. You don't need to have all the answers before saying the first true thing. Sometimes it's enough to have the courage not to be smaller than what you feel. I see you. Until tomorrow.